Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the our latest session in the series Why Marx. Tonight, we're discussing the issue of human nature and its relationship to the idea of socialism. As socialists, most of you will have heard plenty of times in one form or another, slightly patronizing often, socialism is a very nice idea, of course, but human beings are just too greedy, or capitalism is natural, we can't really change all of that, and it's against our nature to share and things. So our speakers tonight are looking at the issue from a number of angles. The issue of alienation within Marx, the role of ideology and other concepts in Marx and Engels who looked at the question. I want to briefly raise something that we're not going to talk about it at length tonight, but we will come back to it in the next session, which is the idea which in my view is the killer argument, really, is the idea that, of course, throughout the vast majority of our existence, we've done exactly that. We have shared things in common. We have lived in common. We have lived in societies and structures which could be called communistic, primitive communism, ur-communism, sharing pretty much everything with each other and without private property. For the vast majority of its existence, that's how humans have lived. Obviously, numbers of humans were different then, and they lived together in smaller villages and societies, etc. But the idea that humans as humans can't live together in a better way than we are doing now is silly. And Marx and Engels have written about that, and we will look at that in next week's sessions. So tonight we're starting with John Holliday, who will talk about the theory of alienation in Marx and Engels and what it means for today. And as always, comrades, please, if you have questions, don't worry about, asking a silly questions. There are no silly questions. There are no wrong questions. If something is unclear or a concept doesn't make sense to you, either put it in the chat, put your hand up and we can bring you in, or put it in the Q&A and I'll read it out. So over to you, John.
Right. Thank you, Tina. I've got some slides if you could reflect those up. First of all, just to reinforce that what Tina just said about asking questions and making contributions, I would encourage people to do that. I'm going to talk about alienation, Marx's idea of alienation, which is quite a complex set of ideas. And I know there will be people in this audience who are familiar with the concept and, may say he doesn't know what he's talking about, basically. We'll take a very critical attitude towards it. On the other hand, there was possibly people in the audience who are not familiar with the term. And I think it's important to recognize that and to ask questions about that for those people who are not familiar with. Not that I promise to be able to answer them, but just to say that my interest in alienation is just that. I see it as central to Marx's ideas and the nature of our existence within capitalist society, and it's exploring that those ideas rather than giving a definitive account of alienation. The first slide, if I could also explain, there's some quite complex words there. I don't speak German, so I hesitate to pronounce those terms, but I think it is, as we've discussed in previous sessions, it is important to recognize Marx's use of language, his use of concepts, his use of words, and it does vary. He uses words in a particular way. And the concepts of alienation that I'm discussing, they are German words, largely taken from Hegel's writings, concepts taken from Hegel's writings. But I think it's important to recognize that. The difficulty in reading Marx as well is he tends to use words in different ways. So his meaning, what he means by particular words, particular concepts, changes as he goes along, changes according to context, according to developments within society. So having said that, I'll just deal with some of those words. I'll start off with that term. The alienation, I think people probably, that is the clearest thing, which I understand to mean to sell an item that's up for sale, can be purchased, and in that purchase, you can lose control of the item. If you're the person selling it, the person buying it then takes control. So it's relation to sale and control. Now, the terms that Marx used, and I'm talking particularly about his work in the economic and philosophic manuscripts from his early writings, 1844, when he's criticizing political economy, the terms that he's using there, ontosern, to sell, to alienate, make external to oneself, I think is that concept of alienation. The term underneath that, ontfremdung, sorry about the pronunciation, to estrange, is the title of the chapter in his book in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, where he talks about the estrangement of labor. So I think it speaks for itself, really. It's making something strange, examining it from a different angle. Why is it strange? Now, some writers make the next term, Aufheben, which again is taken from Hegel, as particularly central to this notion of alienation. And it's quite a complex idea, and people interpret the word in different ways. I think I've given some examples of there: to sublate, to supersede, to transcend, to overcome, while keeping in mind, keeping the context, keeping the substance of the term. So if we're talking about history, it's to overcome previous history while recognizing the developments in terms of technology, etc. So it's transferring what has existed into the past into the future in a different form. So I hope that's clear. But I'd say I don't want to dwell too much on that, only to say that it's particularly important to bear in mind the terms Marx uses. Marx's early writings only really became available, I think, in this country in the 1970s. They weren't translated. And again, I've talked about the economic and philosophic manuscripts, but of course, that's a title that somebody else has given to Marx's notes. It's not a book that Marx wrote. It's an interpretation, a title put on some of his writings. And that's similar with most of Marx's early writings. They're Marx trying to make sense of what is going on in his world, particularly in the philosophical circles that he was dealing with at that time, later on with the political economy, which came from the UK. But to talk about that, a lot of Marx's writings are involved with critique of Hegel's philosophy, Hegel and Feuerbach being, again, someone who developed from Hegel but became a critic of Hegel's ideas. Now, it's those writings. I can't pretend that I've read all of Hegel or all of Feuerbach, very little, in fact. But I'm familiar with some of the ideas, or what I think they said. But to start off with that, Feuerbach's notion, he's criticizing Hegel, but he's also criticizing a notion of religion. And that familiar phrase, I think to most people, it's usually taken that religion, God makes man. That's usually and the man is subject to God. Feuerbach turns that on his head and says, God does not make man. Man makes God in all its different forms. It's human beings in social contexts that create images, that create features, concepts such as God, and then turn that into something that rules them. That notion, it becomes what is known as fetishism, to create something, human beings creating something, which then comes to dominate them. So the fetishism, Marx develops that into a critique of the society from which that religion emanates. Now, Marx sometimes is a critic of Hegel, but he also takes a lot of his ideas from Hegel. And alienation is one of those ideas. It's a term that Hegel uses. But I think Marx treats it differently from Hegel in terms of Hegel identifies alienation with objectification. He doesn't distinguish between the two things. Marx, when he's talking about alienation, that notion of separating from the whole, which exists in Hegel's writing, Marx treats it as a particular feature of society. So it becomes a critique of social labor. For Marx, that's the most important concept, in my opinion, social labor, that human beings create society, have to transform nature in order to live. So in Marx, the critique of religion, in Feuerbach and Hegel, critique of religion and theology. For Marx, becomes a critique of politics and the economy, a critique of society. Have the next slide, please. This is just to reinforce those transformations, which I think Marx makes of Hegel. For Marx, it's that notion of human beings being part of nature, but a particular part of nature that in order to exist has to transform nature, has to create the needs by which it creates needs and creates means by which it has to live. And in so doing, it's in constant relationship with nature, and it changes its production processes, its social relations, and its consciousness. For Hegel, that doesn't exist. He's more or less solely concerned with the consciousness, with ideas, the way that ideas develop within society. So for him, for Marx, transforms that into a relationship with nature, the way human beings transform nature. I think it's important, that second phrase, while I've said that, because alienation is quite often talked about within discussions intellectually, but many people say they feel alienated, and they interpret that as a particular feature of the human condition, an existential condition or a psychological condition. The lonely crowd, people feel isolated, people feel lonely. Now that obviously exists for Marx, but he interprets that particular feeling, those particular feelings of isolation, with particular forms of society, related to particular forms of private property and the social relations that exist within particular forms of society. For Marx, then, he recognized that alienation can exist in all different forms of society under the rule of private property, under sections of society owning the means of production, the productive resources, but it finds its most extreme form, alienation, in capitalist social relations, where basically everything becomes up for sale, commodified. Almost everything can be sold, bought and sold. Those are the dominant relations: commodity production, buying and selling, and including within that notion of everything being up for sale, being commodified, is human labor itself. The very source of human beings' existence basically becomes something that can be bought and sold, social labor. Under the rule of capital, under the domination of capital, labor itself takes the form of a commodity. It becomes labor power and is able to be purchased by the people, the sections of society who own the productive resources. If we could go on to the next slide. Now, I'm dealing here with four aspects that I'm taking from that essay that Marx wrote and the estrangement of labor from the economic and philosophic manuscripts. This is a summary of the ideas contained within that chapter. If I start, I'll start off with number 4, if I can, because I think that reinforces what I was trying to explain in the other sections. For Marx, it's man's relation to nature, human beings' relation to nature. They have to interact with nature to produce the means whereby they live. So all human beings are part of nature, but a distinctive part of nature. And in that section, I'm saying that Marx distinguishes between human beings and other animals. Human beings are animals, but they have a specific relation to nature that differs from other animals. Of course, they have to eat, they have to drink, they have to, procreate. All those animal natures are essential to human beings. But on the other hand, their relationship to nature is different. Whereas most animals are specific to particular features of nature, act for the most part instinctively, live in particular environments with particular needs that can only be met in one particular way, human beings react with nature in a universal sense. They transform nature. They can live in almost any environment. And while they certainly have animal features, they have eyes, mouths, they smell, etc., they can take all these animal features and develop them in particular ways. So while human beings don't have wings, and yet through the use of the development of technology, etc., they can fly higher than any known bird, etc. While they have eyes like other animals, they can have eyes that can develop far beyond, say, the view of an eagle, etc., by the use of telescopes, by the use of technology. So they have a totally different feature, a more universal relationship to nature, one that is being continually extended by the developments of technology and cooperation amongst individuals. You can see that in particular in scientific developments. So they produce universally. Marx takes that up as a particular feature of what you might say is human nature. That is what it means to be human. That is what distinguishes human beings from other animals. That universal approach to changing nature and reacting with nature and creating universal needs which can be constantly extended and met in different ways. So that's an essential feature of what it means to be human. So having taken that, man's creative abilities, man's productive abilities, man's purposive activity, then he takes that into the context in which it is used within a capitalist society. So within a capitalist society, all those creative abilities of human beings in terms of social labor are then put in a context where it becomes a commodity. So in the first point of those things, man's relation, and I'm sorry about using this term man, but it's the term that Marx uses all the time. But what I mean by it is put there the person or the human being. For human beings within capitalist society, labor is external to them. Basically, they have to sell their labor power to the people who own the productive resources. As a consequence of that, it becomes not part of their activity, but becomes something external to them. They have to sell their labor in order to live. So it's a coerced, a forced relationship. So the creative abilities of human beings are then taking place in another context. Having said that, what we then find is, having sold their labor power to a particular employer or a particular financier, whatever, wherever they are able to sell their labor, they are then subjected to that second point, the relation to the product. The product is something external to them. They don't decide what shall be produced. They don't decide how it shall be produced. That relationship becomes the property of those who employ them. It becomes the property in capitalist society of the capitalist. And the human beings, the human labor that's involved in that production then becomes a product of the capitalist. Now, within that relationship, that in itself takes into account that point 3, human beings' relation to other human beings, because they have to sell their labor power to another person, another human being, who then is able to control and direct their activities. So estranged labor or alienated labor creates estranged relationships. There's already that relationship of conflict, of contradictory relationships. But it also extends to the relationships between those people who are involved, the other workers, the other human beings who are selling their labor power, that they tend to be in a conflicting, competing for those those employment rights, whatever they are. They're competing with other workers. That's the nature of capitalist society. It's a totally competitive society, which everybody has to compete with everybody else, and it overwhelms that notion of sociality, which is the basis, in Marx's terms, of non-alienated labor, of social labor. We could go on to the next slide, Tina. Now, those sections are taken from Marx's early writings, his economic and philosophic manuscripts, in particular his critique of political economy of Adam Smith and James Mill, Ricardo, etc. in those days. Some people say that his notions of alienation, very abstract ideas in a lot of ways, disappear. But in fact, I find that they're extended throughout all Marx's writings. And I've given some examples of that we have talked about before, our notion of the fetishism of commodities. And it's Marx trying to get beneath the social relations of capital, which tend to present them as things, commodities, money, wages, capital, etc., things which dominate them. For Marx, those things, commodities, money, wages, capital, express social relations, conceal social relations. So Marx is trying to get beneath those things and explain what the social relations really are. From that notion of fetishism, he develops the notion of reification. And this, to me, is a very interesting concept, because when Marx is writing in the 1840s, when he's doing the economic and philosophic manuscripts, basically he's criticizing capital and wage labor, money, all those social relations, but in a stage when they really aren't dominant. Certainly not in Germany and parts of France. Maybe in Britain, but not elsewhere. So Marx is identifying particular features of those societies, which in those days are unfamiliar to people, but in our day have become almost part of nature, that people don't question anymore why they have to work for wages, why money has such a power over them, why commodities present such an overwhelming force in their lives. They become familiar. People more or less accept that there's a labor market, that they have to present themselves for interviews, that they have to present CVs, whatever the job you're going for, that they have to sell their labor power or register with the state to get a benefit. They're always being forced into those relationships, but it doesn't appear strange to them. Well, for Marx, when it's first developing, it is a strange relationship, and one that is quite recent. When Marx is writing in the 1840s, they are not the dominant relationships. They have since, in less than 200 years, have become the absolutely dominating features of social life. So Marx is trying to get beneath those forms and show basically that another way of life is possible. I've just isolated a few aspects of living within those capitalist social relations. And one that I think most people are familiar with that notion of money. Again, it's something that's central to all Marx's writings. Money, how has it become the dominating feature of social life? As with the other concepts, wages, etc., commodities, they existed in previous forms of society, but they weren't the all-dominating feature of society. I think for most people can recognize that money has become the most, well, I've described it there, under the domination of capital, it becomes man's prime want. A dazzling money fetish which people don't understand, which they have to use in order to survive, and it basically controls them rather than human beings controlling that. It comes down to that notion of social labor, that quote there, the alienated ability of mankind. For Marx, it's social labor. Throughout the world, human beings are subjected to a world of markets and commodities that come from all over the world. That social labor, that productivity of social labor is turned into money, what Marx calls the real abstraction that we use in our everyday life. Everything is converted into money, and we lose sight of the fact that these are all products of human labor in relationship to nature. That extends to the next notion of the world market and the nation state. For Marx, all these forms are forms of social labor. They're modes of production that develop and eventually control human beings. I've talked about that notion of fetishism and reification. It's basically saying that production relations appear as things, appear to human beings as forces of nature. So those things like the world market that we're totally familiar with and controls our life on an almost daily basis, movements of international trade, price crises, etc., appear as something natural, something that we can't control, which we are subjected to. Human beings are subjected to it. That similar relationship with the state or the nation state, it's an abstraction. Political life, it's something that human beings have created, begins to control them rather than they be in control of it. It has a control over human beings, similar to the control of commodities and money in economic life. The state is a controlling feature abstracted. A central feature in human capitalist social relations is that emphasis on the individual. For Marx, the individual is important, but he says that it cannot develop within the social relations of capital. In order for the individual to be fully fulfilled, in order to be a real human being, the recognition has to be one of sociality, the social individual. Within capital, the individual becomes atomized, becomes isolated, and becomes in a competitive state with other people. And it's one of those features that Marx wants to overcome. I'll go on to that last point. I'm sorry to go on so long, but it's this notion of Aufheben, this notion that in Marx, some writers say is far more important than that notion of alienation, because it's the notion that you can overcome alienation, that alienation can be overcome. And Mazaris, I've linked it to two authors there, Mazaris, who's written a book on Marxist theory of alienation, and Bertel Ullmann, also on alienation. Mazaris links that central concept of Aufheben, that sense of transcending, of overcoming, of ending alienation, as being more important than the term alienation itself. Similarly, with Ullmann, he says that you can't understand alienation without understanding something about Marx's notion of communism. And the way Marx would explain it, and what Ullmann takes from it anyway, is communism being a non-alienated society. So I've just left that there with a series of questions about what is the nature of communism if it's that overcoming of alienation? What does it mean to be human, and how can we create a truly human society? What do we mean by a communist society, and how can we basically achieve a non-alienated society? What would that look like? Are we able to envisage it, and are we able to work towards creating that society? It's that relationship of an end of communism, which Marx is clearly concerned about it, but the means of achieving that end. How do we convert that into a political practice that can overcome the problems that we face? Right, I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Can I ask you just to a question of clarification, maybe for the audience? So the rise of alienation, you're saying that, or Marx was saying, that really has, you had in as soon as class society developed, you get a form of alienation. So around the Neolithic revolution, would you say, with the sort of settlements and herds and taming of animals and settling, which is when class society really took off. Is that where you see it developing?
I think that's important to recognize. I think that it is that feature of class society, the rise of class society, of certain sections of society controlling other human beings, and other human beings becoming dependent on the class that controls the productive resources. And of course, that exists in feudalism and slavery, in all forms. Well, in written history, a lot of the forms of society that we read about, experience, have some form of exploitative relations in them. I think that's where it makes that notion of human nature a little bit ambiguous, because there can be all sorts of forms of alienation and exploitation going on. Marx is trying to envisage, because of the development of productive resources, because of the way societies have developed, a potential for a different form of society, not something that determines how we shall live. It differs from Hegel, I think, in that sort of notion of teleology within Hegel, it's the subject becomes absorbed in the absolute. There is an end to history. There is an end to alienation. In Marx, it's an open relationship. It's something that human beings, if they have, there's a potential for communism, there's a potential for a different form of society, but that has to be worked for, that has to be organized. Human beings are purposive creatures for Marx. They develop their productive resources, they develop their social relations, they use imagination, they think, they're able to transform society. For Marx, that becomes that notion of praxis, that you can change society. Human beings make history in context, but they can actually make a difference and can change society. It's having an image of what that society will be and working towards that. There's no inevitability about it, no end to history. It's dependent on what human beings do.
No, indeed. And it's so interesting that you explained, it's not, alienation is not a human feature, we have to feel lonely or whatever. Humans are actual social beings. And for, hundreds of thousands of years, we lived together in a much more human way. This idea that, father, mother, child has to be in their separate little, brick walled house, etc., is crazy in terms of how people actually humanly live together in a much more cooperative way for much of our history.
I think that's right. There is that notion that Marx is somehow against the individual, is against that notion that human beings, far from it. Basically, what he's saying and what it means to be individual is socially determined. And there is a far richer notion. And people talk about, I'm an individual, etc. They're usually, they're talking about, well, I dress differently. Well, I watch different programs. Well, I like different forms of music, etc. But of course, all these things are social relations. For Marx, it's capital. It's capitalism that creates that uniformity of the individual, that destroys individuality, turns everybody into a commodity, turns everybody, well, apart from the capitalist, but even the capitalist to an extent, but everybody becomes a uniform. You all have to go to work for a wage, etc. Where's your individuality then? You're all subjected to an employer. Where's your individuality when you're told what you shall do, how you shall do it, etc.? All those things get lost. Within Marx, he's saying that you can only have true individuality, real individuality in a social setting, in a communist, socialist society.
And it's crazy, isn't it? We work, you work 5-6 days a week to then that last day where you do nothing, where you're just trying to not fulfill yourself, but just do nothing. And that is that's terrible, isn't it? Okay, Ian Spencer now look at the role of ideology-based superstructure amongst other things.
Cool. Very good. That's it. Good evening, comrades, and thank you, John and Tina. Anyone arguing in favour of socialism eventually encounters the argument of human nature. Humans, we're told, usually without a shred of evidence, except for some horror story in the news in the last few days, are greedy, nasty, and would, without restraint by the state and a sense of guilt, would turn the world into hell on earth. Socialism, or communism, we are then told, is a nice idea in theory, as Tina said, but impossible in practice. Naturally, I leave aside any debates around so-called actually existing socialist societies, such as the USSR, to which we will return in a couple of weeks' time. Ideas of what constitutes human nature are as old as written philosophy. The fundamental question of what it is to be human is a central theme in theology and even lies at the heart of contemporary social and biological science debates around whether nature or nurture predominates in shaping human behaviour and society. The question of where Marx stood on the issue is of vital importance, not merely to winning arguments in the pub, but because it was at the heart of Marx's entire project. The transformation of the mode of production from capitalism to communism is concerned with allowing humanity to reach its full potential. From that point of view, communism or socialism, I use the terms interchangeably, is the culmination of what it is to be human. If, for example, we look at the book of Genesis in the Bible, we see that the fall and expulsion from the Garden of Eden as a parable about the separation of humanity from its essential nature. In defying God by eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, humans are separated not only from what it is to be truly human, but also from nature. In separating humanity from its capacity to meet its needs, humanity is compelled to labor on nature to meet those needs, and men and women are also separated. The Christian conception of human nature is then philosophically tied up with dualism, in that the soul is transcendent and independent of the physical nature of the body. The picture is, as you see, by William Blake, The Judgment of Adam and Eve. From Marx's materialist perspective, however, and I quote here from the preface to the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which Marx published in 1859. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. The caricature that we then face is that Marx is an economic determinist, for whom there's a one-way relationship between the economic base of society and its superstructure, including ideology, law, religion, and of course, class consciousness. However, Marx is also clear that ideas too, when they take hold of the masses, are a material factor, and that crude attempt to assert there's a kind of one-way street in the determination of the superstructure by base is something which deserves a fuller discussion in a later meeting. However, last week we discussed the conservative nature of sociology, for example, and the distinction between Marx's materialism and ideological and conservative nature of sociology. And this can be illustrated by comparing how Max Weber, in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argues that Protestantism plays a causal role in the coming into being of capitalist relations of production. For Weber, humans after the Reformation are left in a state of isolation. One cannot obtain absolution through the church or by doing good deeds. The best that one can hope for is to obtain a sign of grace by success in one's worldly calling. This restless desire for success, the spirit of capitalism, helps to bring capitalism into being, if you agree with Weber. In contrast, Marx and Engels discuss the Reformation as an ideological expression of the material basis of society in commodity production. Engels' work is important to note here, and a worthy antidote to anyone tempted to think that Weber is saying anything profound. With his own extensive understanding of military matters and the fact that he put that into good use in the revolutions of 1848, Engels wrote the essay, The Peasant War in Germany. In 1850, he drew the parallel between the uprising led by Thomas Müntzer in 1525 and the stance taken by Martin Luther in the Reformation. For Engels, as for Marx, the motivating force behind the Reformation was economic class conflict, in which Luther expressed in theological terms the ideology of the bourgeoisie. Müntzer, by contrast, expressed the radicalism of an oppressed peasantry, but was ultimately defeated by the combined forces of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. The point here is that religious ideas, like notions of human nature, are expressions of social relations, and they are therefore very real. When we talk, for example, about a reflection of the superstructure and ideology, there's a temptation to believe that somehow that ideology isn't really real. The point here is that because it is an expression of those social relations, it is very real at the time. For example, Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Revolution of the 1640s, provides an expression of human nature that would be recognized by most people today. He argues that for a social contract between the state and the people, in Hobbes's case, he sided with a strong, undivided government, without which, he argues, there would be a war of all against all. This would lead to a society where there will be, quote, no place for industry because the fruit of thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes is clear. Without the state, there could be no wealth, and without wealth, humans would be reduced to a barbarous state of nature. The state of humanity as it existed in Hobbes' day was taken for granted and projected back in time as well as forward in an assertion of an immutable human nature. As we'll see next week, the assumption of a barbarous human nature in the past is unsupportable if we look at the evidence. Instead, Marx in particular asserts a human nature which stands in radical contrast with the ideology of capitalism. As an aside, it's interesting to look at the far-reaching nature of ideology in bourgeois society. If we take, for example, the psychoanalytic perspective of Sigmund Freud, I would argue that his conceptual model of the mind is a reflection of Hobbes's conception of human nature, where the base desires of humans are kept in check by an allegory of the state in the form of the superego, and in particular the ego ideal. Repression for Freud, like strong government for Hobbes, is the price we pay for a civilized society. But of course, for Freud, the other cost is neurosis, as our essential being is denied. With Freud, like Hobbes, there is no means of transcending our current nature, as it is assumed to be immutable. As John has already argued, Ludwig Feuerbach constitutes an important link between the idealism of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and the materialism of Marx. In Standing Hegel on His Feet, Feuerbach prompted a thoroughgoing critique of Hegel by Marx and Engels. In 1844, when Marx was soliciting articles from Feuerbach for the German-French yearbook, Marx wrote to him in very affectionate terms. Engels says that then we were all Feuerbachians. However, it was not long before Marx and Engels superseded Feuerbach and the other young Hegelians. Engels finally gives an account of this in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, published in 1886 in a very accessible pamphlet form. For Marx, human nature is very different from the grim version in the Bible, the work of Hobbes, or for that matter, Freud. However, the consequences of an understanding of Marx's conception of human nature are even more far-reaching than I've previously alluded to. It becomes something of a leitmotif of Stalinism, popularized by Louis Althusser, the principal theoretician of the French Communist Party, that for Marx, there was no human nature as such, but merely historically specific human nature. This is to argue that humans are infinitely malleable. It's also to deny the whole purpose of communism is the coming to being of what it is to be human. It's not difficult to see why such an assertion would be attractive to Stalinist parties and the leadership of the Soviet Union, among others. The assertion that it was socialism was on the basis there had been an abolition of private property and capitalist class relations. However, this was hard to square with a society which still suffered from many of the features of human alienation and many of the social ills that follow from it. One consequence in the USSR that while it was quite possible to undertake high-quality scientific endeavour that was removed from politics or social theory, it was virtually impossible to discuss history, philosophy, economics, psychology, or anything with a social context without being constrained by the party line of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So, for example, the works of Sigmund Freud were effectively banned in the USSR, and paradoxically, all psychology became very close to the most reductionist form of behaviorism in the works of Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Psychoanalysis, which was defended by Trotsky along with the works of Pavlov as both being compatible with Marxism, was banned, not just because it was defended by Trotsky, but because it had the uncomfortable question of human nature, our alienation from it, and the subsequent neurosis that follows from that. The discussion of human nature in the USSR raised the awkward question that if capitalism has been superseded, why was life so awful, and if anything, just as alienated, if not more so than in capitalist societies? The attempt to argue that Marx's conception of human nature was confined to Marx's early works, such as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, ignores the fact that it was also directly referred to in Volume 1 of Capital, where Marx says of the utilitarian philosophers must reckon with, quote, human nature in general, and then with human nature as modified in each historical epoch. Subsequent publication of the Grundrisse allowed conclusive refutation of the legend by Norman Geraas, among others, that Marx's concern with human nature was confined to his early works. In the 1844 manuscripts, as outlined by John, Marx uses the concept of man-species being, which was derived from Feuerbach, to assert that it was class society that limited and restricted humanity. For Marx, humanity species being is free creative activity. Humanity works on nature to meet its needs, and in changing nature, we change ourselves. And of course, Engels, later on in the unpublished manuscript called The Dialectics of Nature, talks about the way, for example, the human hand is shaped by the need to grasp tools. We could go further and actually say it's quite interesting, for example, that human beings have quite a small gut but a very large brain, and that is directly related to our capacity, for example, to cook food and therefore obtain more nutrition from it. We change nature, but in so doing, we change ourselves. Earlier, I alluded to the way in which the discussion of human nature can be tied with discussions around nature versus nurture. As we saw last week with the vulgar distortion of Darwin's theories by Spencer, Marx was constantly engaged in a debate with those who would try to assert a simplistic account of science. We might equally find attempts to put forward a vulgar attempt at asserting human nature on the basis of genetic or other forms of biological determinism. This would be to ignore the recent scientific discoveries of epigenetics and its dialectical relationship with the environment. It's understandable that those on the left would leave room for human agency. After all, it's the left that wants to transform society into a more humane one and that does not destroy the physical environment. However, to do that, we do not have to distance ourselves from a discussion of what it is to be truly human. As we shall see next week, Marx, and in particular Engels, drew on the scientific research of the time, including anthropology, to draw conclusions about how society had been in the past and by implication how they may be in the future. We need have no fear of the concept of human nature. Marx distinguished himself by placing the understanding of human nature on a scientific and historical footing, and in so doing, opened up the possibility of finally realizing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Very interesting contributions from both of you. I wonder if we could, Ian, quickly go through the idea of base and superstructure, which you've mentioned, which I think is always quite interesting, and the role of ideology, because you did say, it's not a one way, and it's not like it's just one sort of having an effect on the other. But there also, as this one shows, the ideological superstructure maintains the base, of course, while the base shapes and produces what it needs to exist. So it's not quite a chicken and egg situation. How do you prescribe it?
Not at all. I think I would want to. I'm no expert on Hegel, but I would want to talk about it in terms of them being, in a sense, interpenetrating opposites. You can't divide them, and the idea that somehow base just simply determines superstructure means what exactly? I mean, the problem arises, I suppose, when you see vulgarizations of Marx's account, and that, I mean, one of the things that was so striking is this idea of that ideas themselves become a material force when they take hold of the masses. If you consider, for example, the English Revolution of the 1640s, I've mentioned Thomas Müntzer in the Peasant War in Germany, but Gerard Winstanley, for example, is expressing the ideas of the radicals within the English Revolution, but he's trying to represent a class which is yet to come into being properly. By contrast, Cromwell and the ideas that are being expressed by the New Model Army in the Putney debates, and these are real ideas that really grip hold of people, and make the difference between the continuing to preserve the last feudal vestiges in the shape of autocracy and its transcendence. Alf Hegel.
So you have the future society already within.
Yeah, and
the old ones.
We can see aspects of it today. I mean, within capitalism, we start to see internationalization. We start to see the crucial importance of planning. it's impossible to have huge companies without planning. But of course, what they don't have is real planning. They end up with a kind of bureaucratic administration, and therefore it fails time on time again, because you can't really have planning without the direct producers themselves. So ideas that will eventually supersede bourgeois society are already present. What needs to happen is them to take hold of the masses themselves. And that's a process of coming into being, and of course, exactly where communists should be exerting their influence.
Of course, the Soviet Union was also defined by a lack of real planning for exactly the same reason, and which is also the way the alienation was never abolished, because it wasn't the workers in control, was it? It was,
and in a sense, atomization, which was even greater, because you never knew who was spying on you. With the idea it was the KGB. It could be the dejordnaya on the student halls of residence where you lived, or your next door neighbor, or whoever else who might hope to gain some petty privileges by grassing you up to the KGB.
Comrades, if you have any questions or just want to make a comment, please come in. As we said, don't feel shy about asking something that you think everybody should know, etc. There's lots of different views on issues, and lots of things we want to clarify by discussing them here. So I've got the first few people coming on. Comrades, if you could please start your videos. That's Malcolm and Brian. And Norman Rimmel, I'm trying to make you into a panelist. You need to allow me to make you into a panelist. Okay, Malcolm, you were first. Did you want to?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can't see you, but we can hear you.
No. Oh,
no worries. Oh, there you are. Yes, now we can.
Yeah, as I understand it, this was called "Does Human Nature Make Socialism Impossible?" Right? Is that what we were trying to decide? Well, I suppose everybody knows. You touched on it, Tina, but I'm surprised that none of the speakers spent any time on most of humans' life on planet, which was about 186,000 years compared to 14,000 years since they decided to be farmers, which is 93% of the time on Earth. So you might think that we are programmed to be hunter-gatherers, in other words, live in social societies. And so I think that, and you can see this, if you look at cultural universals, you can see there's 100 people like going camping, like having barbecues, like blah, blah, blah. There's hundreds of evidence that people still want to be hunter-gatherers as such. And so humans are actually programmed to be social, live in a social society, live in a sort of socialist society. And so how you get back to that, of course, is the question, really, in my opinion. And I would just like to make one other comment. Somebody said the hand was formed to use tools. Yeah, right. Well, actually, as far as I know, the hand is formed so you can cling to your mother's fur, which is a bit unfortunate because humans lost any fur. But if you see a baby, they can do two things. They can suckle and they can grab with their hands. They can't grab with their feet anymore because the toe moved around so you could walk better. So that's what the hand's for, as far as I know. And that's all I wanted to say. But I'll just go back on my point that humans actually want to live in a socialist society. That's what they're programmed to do. And so how we get back from this very weird form that we currently find ourselves in, which is completely alien to us all in every aspect, more or less. I mean, as Tina said, parents living in a little box with their little children and driving each other nuts. I mean, that's completely not what humans are supposed to be doing. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you very much. We will be discussing that next week in some more detail. We thought we should spend a whole session on it because it is a huge issue. And then also, of course, I mean, do we want to go back? Can we even go back, or is there, does it give an idea of what kind of way forward we could, without?
Well, I mean, the point is that I mean, we are sort of, it seems to me, reaching a sort of crunch point with climate change, etc. And so there's two ways of going. One is to have a sort of rich people living in armed enclaves and everybody else, doing the best they can, which is what I think probably will happen. But the other possibility is for the first world, that's us, reducing our standard of living enormously and going back to living a much simpler communal life. I mean, obviously this presents enormous difficulties to get there, but that's actually what we should be doing. I think that's what's inside us. Thank you.
Thank you. As I will be discussing that next week, but thank you for bringing it up again. I think Norman next. Can you unmute yourself, Conrad?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yep.
Good. Yeah, I agree with what Malcolm was just saying about the, civilizations thousands of years ago lived in a much more sort of socialist style of way. I personally think that elements of that are still very much with us. And I don't agree with Marx when he says the individual loses all aspects of social being and develops in atomized form with isolating consciousness. That might be true to some extent, but I don't think there's any evidence to suggest this. And I think one of the problems, my basic point with Marx, I agree with his central point. Power lays in the hands of the owners of the means of production. I entirely agree with that. But when we get on to things, subjects such as alienation, it's theoretical, abstract, and I don't think there's a great deal of evidence, certainly not experimental evidence, to support it. I think the problem is today that the word socialism has negative connotations for many people. I mean, they associate it with the dictatorships in Eastern Europe, in USSR, and so on. So if you ask them, would you like to live in a socialist society? They have that in the backs of their mind and they say no. But if you ask the question in a different way, if you were to say to people, would you prefer to live in a society that is just and much more equal, the chances are that they would then go on to say yes. And I think that is, so the use of language, I think, is very important here. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. John, Ian, feel free to come in if you want to reply to anybody.
Come back a little bit on what I said about the human hand, or what I was paraphrasing Friedrich Engels on the human hand. Not that it only developed for tools, as it were. Chimpanzees have hands and grasp onto their mother's fur, and they also use tools, using little sticks to fish out termites and that kind of thing. But the particular Engels' point is that the particular form taken by the human hand has been shaped by tool use. Just as I then went on to argue, another example is that we have a small gut relative to our size as a primate, compared to, for example, a chimpanzee, but a large brain. Brains are hugely energy consuming, and unless we cook food, we actually can't survive. We have evolved ourselves, which is an extraordinary feature when you think about it, in terms of evolution and human nature. We have evolved ourselves, so we probably couldn't survive on a purely raw diet. And by cooking things, we release more energy than if we didn't. So we end up with a smaller gut, which is handy because you don't need to spend quite so much time digesting stuff, and we can get more nutrients to feed that huge brain. We have changed nature and changed ourselves. That was the only point I was really trying to make. And the other one about experimental evidence. Well, it's an interesting one because, you know, neuroscience is turning up all sorts of stuff, isn't it? And that's what I was trying to get at, really, is that we're not infinitely malleable. There is a certain aspect of what it is to be human, which is transcendent over time. You know, we are inherently social. There's few examples that you can find of human beings that have survived to about the age of 5 without any other human contact. They hardly ever learn to speak properly at all, and are horribly damaged by that experience. You know, we grow and develop in society. We can't do otherwise. You know, Robinson Crusoe would make no sense at all as a story if human beings were somehow supposed to be alone. The lone human being is one of the great mythologies of capitalism.
John, did you want to come in?
Well,
Oh, sorry, I've muted you by mistake. Sorry.
Sorry, no, I largely agree with what Ian's saying. I prefer to hear what other people say, but just on those things about, you know, going back to the past, you know, somebody made the point that human beings have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and the most part of which have been outside those private property relationships that we experience now. Is the development of class society, but it's not easy, is it? Within that, since then, and particularly under capitalism, the form of the society has changed tremendously in development of productive forces, and the social relations formed around those productive forces. That notion of reification makes it difficult to actually undermine the social relations of class domination, of capital domination. And we have to start thinking about, I think Marx says somewhere about, there's that question about why does Marx only deal with primitive communism at the end of volume 1 of Capital, because of course it has to be involved in the origin. But I think in all his writings he's trying to say that you have to start from where capital has taken you in order to fully understand those previous societies, in order to fully understand what it means to be human and the potentiality that human beings have developed since then, albeit in an alienated forms. Those notions that we're dealing with now, that we're using technology we could not have imagined in the past, and it might be oppressive in some ways, but it's significant development. So it's how we overcome that sense of reification. It's how we take advantage of those productive forces that human beings have developed and use them for human purposes. Not something that can be uniquely determined, but something that leaves it up to human beings to develop to develop those systems.
There were, of course, different numbers involved in those communistic societies as well. I mean, you know, we're now 8 billion. You would have to to live like they used to do. You'd have to divide us up into really small, you know, 500,000 people, etc. at one time, which is probably not really doable or, you know, desirable necessarily either. I think it's the question is to learn from that and to move forward in a more human existence with nature as well. That's the issue, isn't it? We used to live very much in you know, with nature rather than entirely making it our, you know, exploiting it as we're doing it today. Brian wants to come in. There's something wrong with your camera, but
yeah, I've got too much protection as usual.
Okay, go on. We can hear you.
I'm sure there's 100 Secret Service or people on my computer. Look, when we discuss human nature, we got to guard against idealism. The key terrain on which we're discussing this is the veil of scarcity. So the question that is posed, what is human nature in the veil of scarcity? And this is the beauty of the critique of the Gotha program. Because you see, the Gotha program is really in accordance with human nature in the veil of scarcity. When Marx says, from each according to their ability, in proportion to their contribution they get back after deductions, what he's really saying is, although workers are working collectively, they are working for themselves, right? Now, in a capitalist society, the average worker works 45 years. The degree of exploitation is 60%. This means that for 27 years of their lives, a third of their lives, they are giving free, gratis, as Marx said, of their life to the capitalist class. Is that human nature, to give away 27 years of your life? Of course it's not. So the reason this happens is, as John described earlier, is to do with commodity fetishism, commodity production. The worker, the spontaneous consciousness of the worker is that of the seller of labor power, the owner and seller of labor power. But when you explain to workers what is really happening under capitalism and what will be happening under the lower stage of communism, they begin to identify that actually a capitalist system isn't in accordance with human nature. The lower stage of communism is. I mean, why work for somebody else when you can be working for yourself? Why give up 27 years of your life to somebody else? So I would urge everybody that politics is practical, science is practical. We need to find practical ways of explaining to workers what is going on and what the communist alternative is. And I have to tell you, whenever I've explained the lower stage of communism this way, it's been very, very effective.
Thank you, comrade. Minnie, please. Caroline.
Hi, Tina, thanks. And thanks to the speakers. Just Graham wants to say something quick as well, if that's okay. I'm not going to be long. Just wanted to talk about accumulation, the accumulation of wealth and the amount of wealth that capitalists want to accumulate. What's that about? You know, why don't they stop at a certain point? Because I'm just referring to the title of, or the question posed about greed, not necessarily individual greed, but the capitalist greed. And I'd also wonder if the speakers could say anything on the mercenary nature of capital. For example, now the privatization of the NHS, that's an act of war upon the working class, middle class, you name it, it's an act of war. So the mercenary nature of capital in exchange for gain, for big bucks, basically. Also, on Brian's point, saying, I think Marx does say that what choice does a worker have under capitalism? It is forced labor, because what choice other than, if you're not earning your means of subsistence to be able to reproduce yourself, you're going to die. Also, I just want to say something about the gut brain thing. And the reason we've got big brains is because we've got small guts and we learn fire or whatever, and we learn to cook meat or whatever. But I've heard and been on talks where, I'm not sure whether the woman's name was Camilla, but talking about, and this is sort of the opposite to alienation really, that we developed bigger brains because we lived communally, and babies were looked after communally and were passed from woman to woman, or, you know, to different people, lots of different people. And that act of seeing different expressions, being warmed up by humanity, basically, the opposite to alienation, is one of the reasons we developed big brains. And I think that's huge. That's a really big thing. Anyway, thank you for that. And here's Graham Casey.
Okay. I'd just like to say I find it difficult to think of common humanity when we're in a situation of class war, not class struggle, class war. And if we look at how these things were years ago under slavery, the slaves were owned, and the slaves would have been considered all different. Some of them would have had more skill than others and been valued. Others would have been considered to have no skill and they could kill them off. With the coming of the factories, factory production decided by the machinery meant that all workers working with those machines would be working at the same rate and would therefore all be considered of the same value to the machine owners. And that would be a difference in how they were looked at. We have a situation now where you also have the advertising industry, because where factories first produced and could sell to, they produced for a community around and sold to that community. Now factory productions, factories are in competition with each other, and so you have the advertising industry, which makes it even more complicated. As I say, I find the situation quite complex, and it's hard to think of a common humanity. As I say, I think we are in a situation of class war. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, comrade. John, Ian, we've got one more person in the audience with a hand up. Do you want to wait, or do you want to come in now?
I just wanted to say that that's absolutely correct about big brains and being social, especially when one considers language. Yes, but of course, other primates are social too. Bonobos or chimpanzees are social, but language, of course, makes a crucial difference.
I think Camilla Power, you mean Camilla Power and the radical anthropology group, they've developed a theory of the human revolution, which has led to all these communistic societies, really, and we'll be talking about that next week a bit more. Sorry, John.
I'll wait, Tina, if that's okay.
Okay. The next person is Sabine, please. People seems to have gone. Sabine. I wonder if she's coming back. Probably not. I'm going to remove her spotlight there. Maybe she's going to pop to the toilet quickly. So if you want to come in now, John. Did you want to reply to anything?
No, I'll leave it to. Are there other people to?
Not at the moment. So, comrades, if anybody has a question or a comment from what they've heard today, please raise your hand and come in. So, we have any concepts that are unclear or any issues you want to discuss. I mean, we could look at the question of. Oh, sorry, Glyn is there. Yes, you had your camera off. Glyn, okay, let's bring him.
I have been here all the time, despite the camera being off.
Okay.
Just three things. One for John. How would Marx use alienation, or would he at all, in relation to what I would see as a truly self-sustaining cooperative? That's just one to. I'll go through the three and then perhaps I could respond. Ian, you talked about the grimness of human nature in the Bible. I would suggest you read that which is the second part, the New Testament, and what I see actually as a base there for a truly socialist state, in the words of Jesus, and I'm not evangelizing there. And then the third, and Caroline made this point also about choice, but Brian made it to the value of educating people into choices, because we do have choices whether or not we join in enabling further exploitation. That's the end.
Thank you. John, do you want to start?
Yeah, because I did. Glyn put something on the chat previously about, and I did attempt to answer that question. Although there's no easy answers to it. Basically, I've certainly got no definitive. But it's that notion of a fully sustainable cooperative, a fully self-sufficient cooperative, and I don't know any such society, or even the potential for such society. The only self-sufficient society would have to be worldwide, wouldn't it? It would have to embrace all of what we know of as society, because of the nature of the society that we've created. Basically, we've created all these interrelationships that we're all almost totally dependent upon. So a self-sufficient society in terms of human needs, what would it mean apart from basic food, food and drink, etc.?
Do we need all the other things?
Somewhere to sleep.
That's a question of choice again.
I think that's
all
right.
The extra things?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right.
Nature that we need those extra things. That's a question that's not posed.
Well, human beings have developed they have developed a dependency on all those things that have been created. May not be, ideal, and certainly in some cases it's not. We're dependent on things we shouldn't be dependent on, and have a destructive capacity for us, in my opinion. It's that notion about education that Caroline mentioned as well. That there's an important section, isn't there, in the thesis on Feuerbach? The educators must themselves be educated. How do we do that? Where do we draw those divisions in society? I think what Marx is saying about that, and I think the phrase comes from Rousseau, the philosopher, the educators must be educated. How do you go about resolving those dilemmas? But you can't resolve it in such a way that there are some people above the other people who educate the people below them, because in itself that creates a relationship of dependency. So I think what Marx is meaning by the educators must themselves be educated, basically they must participate in that class struggle. And I don't mean necessarily in the form that a lot of people just take that in a very limited, isolated form, that you have to get out on the streets and start throwing Molotov cocktails, etc. All forms of activity, all forms of political activity, theoretical as well as organizing and having discussions like we're having now, can be participating in that class struggle without engaging in it. And I think this is the importance of that notion of alienation for Marx in those early writings. He's quite isolated in himself initially in a philosophical circle, but he's engaging in the discussion, trying to get to grips with what it means to be involved in a society that is only in those terms developing, but from which he feels totally alienated. It is like an alien power. It's like being a stranger in something that you can't control. And I have to say that for a lot of socialists, particularly Marxian socialists at the moment, the society we inhabit is exactly like that. In fact, human socialists, Marxist socialists, are probably the most alienated creatures on the planet. We have no very little means of engaging with that. But there's no easy answers to that, is there? Other than what we are attempting here, other than we are attempting to develop ideas that will hopefully extend and enable us to change society. We can't abstain from it. We're involved in it. I don't want to continue to live in this form of society. I don't want my children, the rest of my family, to live in that sort of society. So how do we start about changing that? No easy answers. I certainly don't have them, but I think you have to start somewhere. Marx certainly did start somewhere, and I think his ideas are the most important ideas that we should engage with.
Ian.
A couple of things. First of all, we already live in a world of abundance, in a sense. I mean, if you think about all the jobs that people do that are largely pointless, I mean, don't produce anything of any worth, any value, we could probably reduce the working week fairly quickly down to about 10 hours. Of course, there'll always be some necessary labour, people will still need to be looked after if they're infirm, drains will still have to be cleared. But the difference is, I mean, we can do it collectively as a democratic society, rather than a direct participative democracy, rather than one where cleaning out drains becomes something that other people have to do because better off people don't want to do it. But we can also eliminate much of necessary labour as much as we can. I mean, at the moment, if we have new technology to eliminate utterly boring jobs, that's seen as putting people out of work. Well, of course it does. But would you want to do something that was utterly tedious day in, day out, just for the sake of it? No, of course nobody does. And that's the point that really Marx is getting at in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, that for labour to be truly human labour, it's free, creative labour. We want to eliminate wage labour. We want to eliminate utterly boring, dangerous jobs. No one should have to be a coal miner. No one should have to drive a bloody train all day. Not when we don't need to do that, when that can be automated. Far better if we could develop ourselves in any way we wanted, and that's the point, really. And in so doing, we develop ourselves even more fully. So we already have abundance. The difference is, of course, it's appropriated by an exploiting class, and increasingly so. And of course, somebody's already made the point about the vast accumulations, the vast concentrations, even greater than in Marx's day, in the hands of the bourgeoisie, which I think would have boggled even Marx's mind if he was still alive. Coming back to the Bible, I have read the thing cover to cover, and and I'm not expressing an anti-religious view. I'm perfectly happy in the company of Christian socialists. But what I would say is, of course, what's the transcendence of the alienated human form in biblical terms? I mean, it's either some sort of messianism, or it's the end of days. It's what what Marx is putting forward is the idea that we could actually have. I mean, my respect for the Bible is such that I mean, that's why I wanted to include something about the fall, the fact that truly, the Bible is a truly human document, as is the Quran and so on. And but if we want to really understand it, I would argue that we can understand it better from a philosophically materialist perspective. And moreover, to see the beauty that's in the Bible and other scripture as being an expression of exactly the same aspiration that we have. But in order to, we don't want to abolish religion. We want to abolish the conditions that make religion the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world. Was there anything else? Yeah.
So if I could just come back just briefly on that, and I don't wish to promote further any discussion on religion, except to say it's the ideas that are presented about humans, how humans can live, rather than subservience to a God, which man did create. In all cultures of some form, because it's a way of seeking to understand. And I just wanted to say thank you once again, John, for what you said there. It was very valuable in enabling my thinking to progress also. And thanks, Tina, for bringing these talks together, because it's really a rare opportunity to discuss such matters.
I mean, what I was going to say is that we want to, in the second stage of this series, we want to look at things in more detail. For example, Marx and religion is certainly one of the issues we want to study. So if you or other people in the audience have expertise on the matter, we're not in a closed circle of people who have to give all the openings. So we are looking for comrades who have expertise or interest and want to become experts and prepare sessions for future, so do get in touch if you are interested in that.
Well, I just wanted to say one last thing, and it relates to labour. Ian just mentioned about not wanting to do certain things, like I'll give you an example. I live near Prague, where in the winter, the tram lines are filled with snow and ice. And very early in the morning, there are a group of workers who go out to clear clear the tramways of the ice, the tram lines of the ice. These are the most important people in the whole of the system, because without those, nobody would get to work. And I think that's one of the things that, in terms of how we can look again at the power that the worker has in relation to the whole of the system of capitalism.
Thanks, Comrade. Got a couple of more people with your hands up now. Sabine, you're back. Did you want to come in?
Hold on. Yes, I did. I just wanted to sort of maybe a bit add on to what Ian was saying about the individualization of people. What has changed is also the format of families, i.e., you now have only 1 or 2 generations in a family. You used to have families with various generations in it, grandparents, great-grandparents, or whatever else, which were sort of more communal and used to share sort of things like caring things, like caring for others or for elderly or, you know, vulnerable people. But nowadays, everything is sort of given out, handed over to other people, because it is so individualistic, which is sort of the lost sort of the sense of the big communal group, which they used to have in those things. That is what I meant with the individual or small units, that kind of thing.
Yep,
That's
thank you. That will touch on what we're talking about next week as well.
Yeah.
Rob, please.
Hiya. Yeah, so I've really wanted to contribute to this, but then it's like I'm kind of thinking about I'm going to be presenting at the next session, and a lot of what I could say now is going to apply in the next session as well. So you know, particularly I was almost drawn in by your comment about the Neolithic societies and farming societies and how they were, you know, that was a form of alienation. It's like, well, yes, it was a form of alienation, but then relative to the alienation that takes place in the capitalist mode of production, it was a limited mode of alienation. You know, the proportions of wealth were much smaller between the ruling and the ruled. There's also complicated notions of religion in association with that. You know, the idea of the God King and the different societies, you know, embodying the societal wealth into one individual who is really more of a ceremonial figure than an actual kind of ruler or diktat. And it's kind of understanding that there are these different societal conventions. You know, it's hard to say just how many different societal conventions there have been in the human history. It's an impossible number if you go right back to the foundation of, you know, the start of Homo sapiens sapien, and possibly before looking at new evidence from anthropology and paleontology. So yeah, we'll talk about that more next time anyway. But really, I was interested in what John was saying about like the concept of alienation and how that has, you know, in a way kind of, you know, that's a bastardization of the true nature of humanity to, you know, and its relationship to labor. And I was wondering if John could really expand on how that is distinct in the capitalist mode of production as opposed to previous historical modes of alienation. Also, I wanted to kind of come back on what Norman was saying about the kind of disagreement about with the kind of conception of atomization and kind of say, you know, from a historical perspective, looking at since the kind of dawn of capitalism in the 19th century and early and late 18th century, how much the societal structure has moved away from a communal based structure to an individualized structure. And that, yes, we are social beings, but in, you know, our social, you know, our family life is set distinct from our work life. You know, there is these barriers that are put in place in the capitalist mode of production that have increased atomization. You know, the fact that there aren't large family groups living in the same way as they currently are in different parts of Africa. You know, where there's a real, you know, stacking of great grandparents and grandparents and parents and aunties and uncles, and they live in a communal creche of, you know, 35, 40 people. It's a complete, you know, that is a very different, you know, we are certainly more atomized in our current society than we are in that sense. You know, that there are these barriers between our relations. They aren't as fixed as they previously were. So those are my really only really comments that I can make, and just thanks to John and Ian for your presentations.
Thanks, Rob. John is in the audience, but I don't think your camera works, so you can just speak now. John Fitzgerald? No. Okay, Brian, I think, wants to have another bite of the cherry as well. You can speak now.
You're very generous, Tina. I didn't even have my hand up.
Oh, you did. You don't have
I never turned down. I never turned down a chance to make a contribution.
Go for it.
Look, my overall comment is, in a group like this, it's fine to discuss at the level of historical detail that we have been. My concern is that this group should have a second function, and that is to prepare us to have a dialogue with the working class. And, you know, Marx and Engels used to always say that science is practical. So we should try and distill the knowledge we have into a propagandistic, usable form. It is possible. This is the art of making propaganda, converting the science and making it accessible. So, Tina, I don't know, at any stage will we be discussing program or something like that?
Well, we're not a party, although there is a certain logic to
No, I don't mean program as developing a program, but the use of propaganda, the use of programs.
Right. Well, not at the moment, but certainly, I mean, education is the first start, isn't it? And trying to see where we agree, where we disagree, if we can move forward and produce other things, certainly. You know, we wouldn't rule it out, I'm sure, but we're at the beginning of a process in that sense.
Right. Because, sorry, just to finish off, because I'd like us to have another discussion on the critique of the Gotha program without any arrogance. I'm always amazed at how few people really understand what Marx was actually saying there, mainly because he's at fault. That was a polemical document, not a pedagogical document. So some of the language is a bit obscure, and I think has been made a bit obscure in order to pass Engels' judgment. But there's so much in the critique of the Gotha program, particularly when we apply it to the Soviet Union. And I think that would take our theory much, much further. So can I appeal to you to have another session on the critique of the Gotha program?
Sure. I mean, we were thinking of structuring the second half or the second part of this series around thematic questions, you know, Marx but we could, I can't see why we can't have a session on Marx and the Gotha program. And I'm sure critique of the Gotha program, I'm sure will come up in other sessions as well. But are you volunteering?
Yep, absolutely. It's my favorite document in the whole wide world.
Okay, a bit sad, but hey.
Why should it be sad?
I'm joking.
It's a gateway to the future, which hardly anybody uses, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I've taken a note.
All right. I'll haunt you if you don't.
Oh dear. Okay, John's next.
Yeah, just on that point, because I think that's the sort of ideas that we need. I mean, we have to face the fact we are very, very isolated. And I'm struck by, you know, when I talk about political practice, what would we have to do to change the society in the way that we want it? The abolition, in my terms, of wage labor, of the capitalist mode of production, very ambitious, and we're very limited in our form. But the alternatives that people are being presented with at the moment are so negative. I'm just thinking about Keir Starmer's Labour Party and the mission statement and what's involved in it. You know, we have to increase our growth rates. We have to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 economy, G7 or G20. We have to increase productive investment. We have to make ourselves business friendly. We have to We have to develop our youth so that they're suitable wage slaves, basically suitable for the occupations that the British capital needs in order to increase those growth rates. So basically, a program or a proposal for capital, for increasing the domination of capital within British society in competition with the other capitals around the world. That's what we're being presented with as socialism. Now, that is such a negative proposition. So we have to start somewhere to give people a real alternative to that. And that's not going to be easy. If I just come back for a second on, Rob's question about, the nature of alienation and, the different forms that it's taken in previous societies than capitalist society. I think Marx is focusing alienation on capitalist society precisely for those reasons. It is about sale. It is about buying and selling, and labor itself taking a commodity form as labor power. That is different from the other forms of society. And it's an all-dominating feature of society, the domination of money, of wage labor, of commodity production. Dominates everything else. And the fundamental feature of that is that saleability. Everything becomes up for sale, including human labor itself. So I think that's the significant difference between that and other forms of society. Obviously, as I said before, commodity production, money, etc., did exist in previous societies. It's the all-dominating feature of the capitalist mode of production that makes it significant and makes that notion of alienation from that form of society. Basically, a society based on exchange relations, capitalist mode of production. What I think socialism at a fundamental level is that production for use to meet human need, which clearly existed in previous societies. They weren't all non-exploitative, but there where they were exploitative, the exploitation was visible. You knew who was the landlord, who was the boss, who was, etc. You knew who was the slave owner, you knew who was the baron. Within capitalist society, that's hidden behind a series of, we're all free to sell our labor. We're all free in that predominantly market society. That's what I think makes Marx's notion of alienation so significant within the capitalist mode of production.
Thank you. We have one last person with a hand up. There's more time if anybody else wants to ask a question. John Fitzgerald, I think your camera doesn't work, but you can speak.
Yeah, it's not working at the moment. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Well, thank you to all the speakers and the contributions from various people. Yeah, it really does all the discussion open up your mind as to what is, how is it possible to bring about a communist or socialist society. And I suppose, I'm living now, and I come across quite a lot of people who have mental health issues, and increasing more and more. And capitalism itself has, well, there's a link as such as to how people, the fact that they're just cogs in a wheel. So that the relationship between psychology and alienation and so on. But I really do feel that so many people are alienated, have mental, problems. And what is that link to what Marx kind of talks about, when he his definition of alienation and stuff. And the other thing, actually, just on a information note, Tina, Steve Friedman I've been trying to contact him, and he said that if I ask you what the Republican link is, the Republican group, that you could send it to me.
Yep, I'll do that.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. It's been difficult to get hold of. Yeah. So you're going to put it in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, or I can email you afterwards, actually. But
or email me. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got my email.
I can.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, no worries. Okay, thank you, comrades. Very interesting discussion. I think we have a few minutes for Ian and John to sum up, perhaps, and make their key arguments in a nicely rounded way. Ian, how about you go first?
Well, I've been given an irresistible prompt by the mention of mental health. That's obviously my trade, as it were. It's not accidental that the growth of the asylums is at about the same time as the growth of industrial capitalism, in particular urbanization and the separation between people as a consequence of that. That doesn't mean to say I'm asserting a causal relationship between capitalism and mental ill health, but there is an aspect of that. And there is very good empirical evidence that, for example, people who are more isolated are far more likely to become ill, that more social societies, or societies where the gap between rich and poor is narrower, have generally better mental health. And I think that it's not accidental, and it's not unrelated to the whole question about human alienation. Capitalism is a horribly destructive system. I'm not arguing that feudalism was any better, but at least in a feudal society, you weren't separated from what you needed to be able to eat, and you weren't necessarily separated from other people of all sorts of generations. So I think it's an absolutely pertinent point, and a good place to end. If you really want good mental health, you really need to get rid of capitalism.
Indeed. Thank you very much. John.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for everybody's contributions. It is always very welcome to know that there are other people who are concerned about similar issues, whatever they, however they see those solutions being resolved in some ways. I can sound quite negative. We are all alienated, and capital is so overwhelming and so reified that it's difficult to envisage a different structure. But of course, that there is always the class struggle, always going on beneath the surfaces. And that's quite obvious to us in this country, in terms of strikes, etc. It struck me when Glyn was talking also about situation, I think he said, where he lived near Prague, about the people who clear the ice. That notion of sociality is underlying that notion of social being. It's everywhere, really, everywhere. It's just bringing that to some sort of fruition, isn't it? When you look at the earthquakes in Turkey and you see the people basically rescuing people from buildings, putting those buildings up. Even in the refugee crisis, you see the potentiality of people to identify with those refugees, to take on board the problems. It's not all entirely negative. Strikes and things, union organization, people who are prepared to stand up to the system is there. And of course, you can see it in those people, not necessarily taking a socialist direction immediately, but the protesters against climate change, against all the oppressive features of capitalist society are there on a limited form and not always entirely covered by the media that we have. But it's important not to forget that those struggles are going on, and we have to somehow link those struggles, people's struggles, with our attempt to create or envisage a different form of society and work towards the creation of that form of society.
Absolutely, but it's crucially important that we understand how capitalism works, doesn't it, in order to overcome it. This is why we're spending quite so much time on Marx and Engels, the idea that, capitalism is not natural. It wasn't always there. People didn't always exploit each other. That's not human nature. It's really important we get these things right and can then go out as well, talk to strikers, talk to other people on picket lines, the climate change activists, etc., who perhaps haven't studied all of these issues, and have a dialogue with them and educate each other. Hugely important. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us tonight. As we said, next week we will be looking more into that issue of Urkommunismus, as Marx and Engels called it, and how humanity has lived together for hundreds of thousands of years in a very different way, and what it means for today. Do we want to go back? Can we go forward? How can we use that knowledge to move forward in the future? Thank you for joining us, and see you next week. Bye-bye.